Greetings, Nonymous here. So something that comes up a lot when we're talking about martial arts is the reality of it. One thing that I think most martial artists, at least implicitly in the back of their heads, are going for is some semblance of reality, some semblance of a real fight, either with swords or bare hands or what have you. Some way of really testing one's skill and mettle in the most primal of contests, right? One person against another person, or in other senses, in battlefield where you have many people over a large space that are going at each other that way. And so that's always in the back of our mind, that these arts are designed for that and were practiced in that way. Now, there's always a trade-off that we have as martial artists. And this is just one of the trade-offs that we deal with, and that is reality versus safety. And there's a lot of different thoughts on that particular topic. We generally put them into three categories as far as protocols that we can use for safety and realism, kind of both. That is the type of weapons that we use, the type of gear that we use, and the types of rules that we institute when we play. So, on the gear end of it, and because this comes in with the gear mostly, but it does relate to the other two as well, with the realism, is one thing that is often brought up is fear. Training with fear, or training under fear, training under some sort of pressure to perform with dire consequences. And this was a feature, and is a feature, of combat to the death with weapons, in our case swords, that kind of thing. It was a aspect of using swords when they were used in this fashion. Now, to a large extent, I'm not saying there are places in the world that are exceptions to this, but to a large extent, the use of swords has gone out of general use of the populace for self-defense needs. Nowadays, handguns and this type of thing is far more popular. On the battlefield as well, it's all firearms, explosives, ordnance, all of that kind of thing. Getting away from the melee type combat, the swords, the knives, and that kind of thing. Although knives and bayonets are still used. So the fact of the matter is as modern people, we are somewhat divorced from the reality of a world ruled by the sword. We live in the world that's pretty much ruled by the gun. And in that respect, trying to recreate the sword arts and all of that will always require a little bit of interpretation and a little bit of guesswork. We don't know what it was like back then exactly. We have accounts and we can guess and all this, but generally not. So when we're practicing nowadays, and I hope this is true of everybody, the partners are not trying to actually kill or wound each other. They're trying to land hits, they're trying to do this. They may be trying to pretend to wound the other person, but the fact of the matter is, none of us actually want to hurt or kill anybody, especially that we're practicing with. If we're in a school, like a fencing school or anything like that, we're obviously not going to do that. If we're in any type of sword school, the idea that these people are going to be legitimately trying to actually hurt each other for the sake of hurting each other is hopefully way out of left field. So all of our encounters, even in a competitive sense, we know our lives aren't on the line. This is going to change the dynamic. So, do we put fear into training? Fear obviously changes our behavior. It changes the way that we react to things. So should we include it in our training? There may be an argument for including it in training. However, I think there's a really large argument for training that part totally separately. When we're talking about the way fear will change our techniques or the way that we move, it's generally in the negative. The argument for training under fear is that you get used to doing things in that stressful situation, and therefore you will be more likely to think clearly about what's going on and not get flustered and all of that. And that is true. However, when you're learning swordplay, and you're learning your basic parries and your basic cuts and your basic thrusts and your footwork and your positioning, and you're learning this whole new thing that's coming in, that's probably not high on your list of priorities. Number one, no matter what you do, whether you wear gear or not, whether you use foam weapons or sharp steel weapons, if you've never fought with a sword before, chances are you're going to be pretty freaked out the first time you do it, right? So fear's a part of it already. Now, yes, it's not a deathly fear of anything like that, but as I've kind of described, I don't think that we can really ethically attain that level of fear or try to recreate it unless we are actually training military people to do this, and in that case, we're probably going to do it like them. They don't train the fear and the psychological aspects of the thing at the same time as they're teaching, taking care of your rifle, right? So you're going to learn how to disassemble your firearm and reassemble it and all this other stuff. You're probably going to learn that first in a controlled setting. And then you're going to kind of gradually build up to the point where you're doing it under stress in a stressful situation. And even then, they're probably going to be very keen to tell you that this is basic training. This is training. When you get out in the field, it's going to be a lot different. You don't know what's going to happen. You could be having mud and water being constantly thrown on you. You could be doing it on an unstable surface. All of these other things, right? So in reality, if we can call it that, right, because we're really trying to discern what is reality and what isn't, the fear is going to be there. That's probably one of the reasons that we all like doing this. There's an exhilaration to it, to get up against another person, right? And it really doesn't, in my estimation, it really doesn't matter what you do. Now, people's solutions to training with fear and trying to attain this realism are different and varied. They will range from full gear, throwing full force blows with heavy weapons made of steel and all of that, to, on the other end, doing it with no gear, no anything, just basically doing it as you are, with sometimes wooden weapons, and I've seen, of course, sometimes people do it with sharp steel weapons. That last one I mentioned, I do not recommend that. Not exactly sure what one would get out of that would be applicable to today's life, but hey, if some people want to take their own livelihood and health into their own hands, that is their business. So there's a lot made of that. Does gear, and we've talked about this before, does wearing gear like a helmet create bad habits of not being afraid of being hit in the head? I have not seen that. In fact, quite the opposite. I feel that wearing a fencing helmet, when both people are wearing a fencing helmet, you can actually throw full force and full speed blows at the person's head, right? Which will make it far more realistic in a mechanical and technique sense, to block or to parry or to properly respond to that threat. If you're not wearing gear, as we said, the dynamic that we have is none of us really want to hurt each other, right? So we're going to be pulling our blows. We're going to be hand shy, right? Will that translate later when we are wearing gear? Where all of a sudden now we're hyper aware of our head, hyper aware of this, and now we become paralyzed when somebody is feeling freer to move around, right? So these are all trade-offs. You have to trade off safety and realism a little bit, because when we get down to brass tacks, in weapon work and sword work, realism means killing somebody, and we're not killing anybody anymore, not with these. So that's a dynamic that doesn't really exist for us, and especially those of us going here. Now, the argument then often translates into sport versus traditional martial art, and this and what's more realistic. Well, it's kind of a toss-up. Let's take really formalized martial sports like kendo and fencing. Now, both of these sports are reminiscent of sword play. They are descended from sword play, but they're both very highly ritualized. They have a very rigid rule set and breadth of technique in which they use, and the main component of it is the competition, whether you're putting yourself up against another person or whether you're in a team or anything like that. So what's happening is those techniques, while they may not be numerous or as varied as, say, in a traditional martial art, they are being applied for a singular goal. A singular goal which would be very similar to one in an actual duel. Also, in competition, if people are following a competitive martial art like fencing or kendo or MMA or anything like that, chances are they place value on that competition, and there's a fear in losing. There's still the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat. While these things are not the same as fearing death, they are analogous, and they do create the same types of stress, maybe not in the same levels that an actual fight would do. Now, often traditional martial arts do not have a competitive aspect. Then there's several reasons for this and all of that, but they focus more on the training and more of the preparation and all of that. In that sense, a lot of that is far more, shall we say, intuitive, but also theoretical. They're not constantly testing these techniques against opponents who are not afraid of getting hurt. Because that's another thing, is that when you're going up against somebody who has the intent to kill you, do they have the same level of fear? Are they reacting the same way that one would when they're just afraid? Will you react the same way if somebody is aggressor toward you, rather than you being an aggressor towards them? These are all the questions that we come into. So there's a reality to both of the methods. The traditional method deals with a particular type of reality, a theoretical preparation, an expansive reality, and the competitive deals with a very narrow and focused reality. Both of these are reality, so it's not that one is real and one isn't. Now, I'm not going to go in saying what art is better, because no art is better. If you are a fencer and you are required to use a weapon that weighs 2.5 pounds and must be wielded two-handed, you may feel a little out of your area, right? Same with if you took a kendo person and gave them a fencing weapon. So they're very, very specific to their sport and all of that. However, they are both analogous to actual swords and all of that. So that those types of skills can easily transfer over. Now, of course, people cannot learn what they haven't been taught or what they haven't been exposed to. So the drawback to a sport is perhaps that, whereas with the drawback to a traditional martial arts is the testing of the skill aspect of it. So yeah, so that's kind of like a basic of the three methods. You have your gear, right? If you're wearing gear and your partner's wearing gear, you can both throw full blows at each other without fear of injuring each other. That makes the combat techniques that you are performing much more realistic. It will make your overhead block more effective because this person can actually hit you really, really quick. So you know exactly how quick you have to bring up your weapon. Whereas if you're playing with the slow sparring where you don't have any gear on, but you're just kind of moving slow, now that's another specific type of skill. That's your precision and all of that. But it's an entirely different type of exercise. Not one of them is better than the other. I think they should all probably be somewhere in your training in your training regimen, if that's what you're going for. If that kind of hyper reality is what we're going for. Now, of course, using fictional weapons or using LARP weapons, whatever, that doesn't really bother me. A weapon is a weapon. It's always going to be an analog. I hope people aren't actually trying to cut each other with these things because that would not be good. Anything that you use is going to be some version of reality, right? Our martial arts now have pretty much reside in the sport area. They have self-defense applications and stuff like that, but even traditional martial arts, which I practice, pretty much a sport. Right? We do them for our own benefit, for our own growth, and that is sort of a new thing to practice martial arts just for you, just for yourself. That was a freedom that was only enjoyed by higher aristocracy and stuff like that in China and in other places in the world. Other people had to learn martial arts to survive. They didn't really understand what a martial artist was. Martial arts is just something that you should know, in that sense. So, okay. So, that's basically it. Fear. We want to have some fear in our training. Do we need to go into situations without gear and all of that? Will that add to our skill? More than likely not. It will probably, and we can see this a lot with regular athletic training, that if you focus too much on that aspect of it, of the fear, you will create hand shyness where people will not be kind of attacking it. Now, one of my school swordsmanship kind of characters, words that we put forth as something that's really important is courage, and that's, as far as sword instructor goes, it's one of the things that you're trying to constantly impart into people, especially when they first start out, is have some courage. Go for that hit. Rush in there. Do something. Because the temptation just to stand at length from each other and throw random strikes at each other is almost ubiquitous amongst beginners. where you want them to take the initiative. You want them to come in. You don't want them to keep backing up out of the ring. You don't want to keep them on the defensive. You want them to take the initiative and come in and all of that. And that takes courage. And it's not always just the courage of us getting hurt. It's the courage and the confidence, really, that we have that we won't accidentally hurt our partner. Teachers will often demonstrate things without gear and all of that kind of absent-mindedly because we're very comfortable with all of this stuff. Until you're very comfortable with all of your technique, I don't really think it's a good idea to integrate fear and that psychological training into things at that point. It's just too risky. And it probably won't give you a benefit that is worth the drawback there. All right? Okay, so that's just a little bit on that topic. Probably be revisiting other training aspects like this, dealing with reality, because there's a lot of things that we can talk about when we're talking about reality and bringing martial arts into reality and what that means. So we'll look for that in a future episode. So until then, I will bid you farewell. Have a great day. Happy Saber.